Okay.
Yep.
It's being recorded.
Works. Okay. Would you like to introduce yourself first, Jackie?
Okay. Well, so I'm Professor Murray, and I'm at the University of Kentucky in the Modern Classical Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And I teach classics, primarily Greek literature, Greek language. Sometimes I do Latin, but I usually leave that to my far more expertise colleagues who teach in Latin. So, what can I do about that? um, and so to introduce the course to my students, so the course is Black Classicisms, and we're going to be looking at for the long part of the course, we're going to be looking at W.E.B. Du Bois and his thoughts about the ancient world. But at this point in the course, we're meeting up with my colleague, Professor Anja Bettenvoort in Cologne, with her students. And they have been looking at Africa and the classics. And so this portion is where we overlap. And we're going to be talking about race, Africa and the classics, the ancient world, um, where Africa fits into the classical world or the ancient classical world, and so it's a perfect point to have both classes overlap. And so today, as I guess the first in this overlapping section, I'm gonna talk about how we're going to be talking about race and about race in America, since we're really going to be looking at America and Germany. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works now. Should be able to share the screen. There we go. All right. Okay, so can everybody see the screen? Just want to verify that that is
Yes.
the case. Okay, great. Okay, so I thought so. Yeah, so this is I just put this up just so we know what class we're in for the video for my students. Okay, and let's see if we can get the thing to move. All right, and so this discussion today is going to be about race, slavery, and classics in America. And every time I do something, yeah. And so what I thought I would talk about will be first, we need, since we're going to be talking about the ancient world, we need to have a transhistorical description of race. So because race is historically contingent to the moment in which it's operating. Race today is not the same as it was 2,000 years ago. Race in America is not the same as it is in Germany. Race today, 2021, is not necessarily the same in America that it was in 1619 or 1492. So it's a moving target. And so it's important to have a transhistorical perspective on race. I'm going to talk about that. And then I'm going to give you a kind of brief history. I have it like from the founding fathers to the Capitol insurrection. I'm going to compress it all down into like, uh, a couple of minutes. But the thing I want to highlight really as I'm going to do this history is the relationship between race, slavery, and then classics. Okay, and then and throughout this, I'm going to be using W.E.B. Du Bois by way of introducing him. His scholarship on race in America, because he's actually one of the first scholars of race and of also thinking about race as a social construction too. So and he's also lived long enough to have a full perspective on the differing aspects of race. So let's first go with the transhistorical definition. Let's see if we can get that. Okay, so and I've so when we're going to talk about race, I want to begin by interrupting the dangerous tendency to think about skin color, relying on skin color, or physical features as an indicator of race, as a criterion, as if it were a stable, fixed criterion. So what I'm going to be doing is introducing a spatial metaphor later. But one of the things that we want to get that's really crucial to race whenever it appears, it's always about a power dynamic where you have a dominant group oppressing another group or exploiting another group. Um, and the way to think about it, most, and this is most theorists and philosophers from Du Bois forward, or even maybe a little bit before, what we're thinking about is like a hierarchical ideology, um, where the idea of oppression, the idea of exploitation, is prior to the creation of the criteria that are going to identify that you're going to slot people into a race. And it's from the perspective of the dominant group. So basically, then so races that are not determined by descent. So the way we talk about race, I think, inaccurately, or because we're under the spell of what we'll get to, this concept of race craft. We talk about it as if it's some kind of real descent group or something like that, but actually. That's actually part of the racism that's going on. So races are not determined by a descent group or any other alleged objective quasi-empirical datum that exists apart from racism. So scientific studies continually show that there's no genes for race. Um, but somehow scientists are still looking for it as if they're going to find it because they're captured by the racism. So races exist only where a group of people with hegemonic control of the society or greater military might is, quote, minded to adopt and to act upon some policy more or less oppressive or repressive in dealing with other people. Um, and so in his book, Theodore Allen, in his book on the invention of the white race, he talks about, like, from a historical perspective, what we're looking for is patterns of oppression, subjugation, exploitation, subordination, persistent patterns and systemic. And that's where we will see race, when one set of people is oppressing another. Um, and so oppression, exploitation are then inextricable from race. And this will and so what you can have is like a dominant group um, they're going to be dominating other groups or another group, if it's just one, um, and that will to dominate them is going to stimulate ways of making them different and inferior. And it's not just making people different and inferior in terms of ideas, but it's also laws and actions, and various systems of oppression. All right, so let's get to um, the next point I want to make. So let's get to some just basic definitions then. So one thing to have in mind is that, all right, racism is going to be, as I say, ontologically prior to the construction of the categories of race. So before you have, say, white and black, today, we're talking about today, white and black races, you first need to have the desire to oppress one of these groups, and from the perspective of the group that's going to be doing the oppressing. So the white oppresses black, right? And then well, who counts as black? Then you start defining who counts as black, based on various criteria. Or if so that's not, so you have to have, I just want to make sure everybody gets this. You have to have the will to oppress before you start saying that there are races. And this is going to be relevant, especially when we go looking into the ancient world, where skin color and Africanity is not operating in this way of race, right? Where it is today. So one way of sort of taking off our modern glasses, as it were, when we're looking at race. All right, so let's go to the next one. So the other thing is that they're not given in nature, right? So uh, you know, they're categories that are imposed upon nature, but they're not given in nature. And so the dominant group is going to see categories that are going to serve their interest. And so that's one thing. So you're going to create categories. Um, and then you're also going to maintain them by various mechanisms to naturalize them. Um, and the point of these mechanisms is to maintain this hierarchical power, hierarchical structure um, over time, where the dominant group is always maintaining itself in the dominant position, and due to historical events, contingencies, etc., the system has to keep recalibrating itself, right? As various forces in the culture, or as history goes forward, and people interact with each other, you need to recalibrate these categories, or recalibrate the ways in which you're sustaining these categories. All right, so it's kind of theoretical right now, but I'll I'll keep it'll get more exciting later. Okay. Um, all right, and so a third point is that, okay, so one way of talking about it is that it erases um, institutionalized oppression. So um, one person having prejudice against another person, or another type of person by yourself as an individual, um, it's not necessarily race, unless you're part of some larger structure. So um, you can have maybe I don't like people with curly hair. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say that. I actually have curly hair. Okay, I don't like people with straight hair. Okay, and so, and I personally, as an individual, discriminate against everybody I meet with straight hair, right? That's not necessarily any kind of racism. Right? Because I, as an individual, don't have laws, and I don't have societal power to reinforce my view. Right. So that's where, so when we're talking about race, we're talking about a larger structure of prejudice and discrimination that is sort of institutionalized, and supported by all these cultural and legal factors. Okay. So, so and this is where we talk about unstable signifiers, like me saying, well, I'm going to categorize people with straight hair as problematic in my world, right? So now, if we, you can imagine a universe where there's lots of people like me who have the same view about people with straight hair, and we want to exploit the folks with straight hair because, we need labor force. So we then create a race of straight haired race. That's their race, right? So the curly haired people versus the straight haired people. And we have the military might to establish a country, and we have the laws to reinforce that, right? And so then it becomes racism, right? But if it's just me by myself, with my own weird attitudes, that's just me being prejudiced. Okay, so there's another way of thinking about how the individual intentions versus the structure, because a lot of time people think about, well, um, they want to see race to be completely intentional, and it's not racism if the person didn't have any intention. But no, there's also these larger structures that are in place that's actually creating the system. All right, so let's go on. All right. And so, but let's get to this continuum. I was going to say, try to help us out. So I get this continuum from a scholar, Adolph Reed Jr., in his essays on race and society, et cetera. And he talks about the idea that, well, when he was asked the question about, well, what is the difference between ethnicity and race? And he's talking in terms of, again, prejudice and domination, right? Because there's other ways of talking about ethnicity in terms of ethnicity being um, what people sort of self-construct their identity. But in this case, we're talking about where ethnicity and race actually do come together in um, a dynamic of oppression. He says, well, I said that race and ethnicity are simply categories of social hierarchy. They're just labels for different magnitudes of difference, from the most desirable on desirable status on a continuum of okayness. He refers to it, right? And so I would put, here's our continuum. I've created our continuum of okayness here. And so this is, so I'll try to explain what he's getting at. And so the idea is that there's this, and it's from the perspective of the dominant group, right? So from the perspective of the dominant group, that is the group that has hegemonic control over culture, that is always on top. The majority of the most powerful people are in that group. This group determines who, which other groups in the society are their ethnicities and which others are races. And um, so, and to the extent that they assimilate you, then you are the closer you are there through assimilation, and to the extent that they're seeing you as different, then you move toward the race, the race side. Now, the thing that's determining this, I would argue, is the issue of dehumanization and uh, alienated, what I call alienated and alienable humanity. So the dominant group assumes for itself that their humanity is inalienable and that people should not um, uh, enslave them or wipe them out, this kind of thing, because their humanity is inalienable. However, because it's a hierarchical structure, they do not grant this equal humanity to others in their system, right? So, in the case of ethnicities, they ethnicities have an alienable humanity in that whenever the dominant group sees it to their benefit, they do grant them equal status. However, it's always based on the dominant group's perspective, and they can take it away. And so what you find, if you're in the category of ethnicity, then you're constantly being pressured to assimilate to the dominant group, right? And so you get that. So the forced assimilation in terms of maybe your cultural things are being removed, etc. And but if you're a race, and with your race though, they've decided you're not, your humanity has been alienated, and this is the thing. So, and you need both. In fact, you need both groups. You can't, because you need the threat of being alienated to maintain the ethnicities in their position. Like the fear of being alienated will is a good sort of goad to make you assimilate to the dominant group. And so in societies that have a dominant group and multiple other ethnic groups, and you see this dynamic happening in the United States is a clear case of where that is absolutely the case, where you have African Americans, Black people are a race, and maybe Asian, Jewish people are ethnicities, and white people are the dominant group. And the ways in which the society is organized is maintains white people at the top through manipulation of um, the way Black people are treated as a terror tactic for Black people, to keep Black people in the racial category, but also to get the ethnicities to assimilate. And to the extent that say right now, what we can see is happening with Mexicans and Arab people in America is that they're being pushed into the race category, right? Um, by propaganda and policies of the government. So the thing to get to is that it's always a moving dynamic, right? It's not a static thing. So if we went even 10 years ago, the way in which the ethnicities and African Americans would be on different categories. But what's clear though is the being in the racial category is harder to move out of than being pushed into it. Is easy. You can easily be pushed into it, but being coming out of once racial category, once you've been racialized, it's almost impossible to come out of, and that's kind of the struggle that we're in. All right, let's go. Okay, so now how do we get this stuff working? Well, these scholars, Barbara and Karen Fields, and I strongly recommend this book. I don't know if it's translated in German yet, but it's really good for getting a sense of um, what actually creates race. And they point up, they call it racecraft, sort of comparing it to witchcraft, in that it's this way in which you're made to believe that something that is actually um, an invention is actually natural and real and exists outside in the natural world when it's actually been constructed. So, what are the mechanisms in the society that make you think that race is real, right? And so they call this racecraft. And so I think about it like as an Ouroboros, right? So on the one hand, there is racecraft. We want to create a the we want to create the straight hair people as a race. So we tell stories, we create a science, we create laws, we create, they have to wear different clothes, we create all kinds of systems in the society that makes them um, appear very different, right? And then that justifies the fact that they're a race. So we constantly make them, we treat them in ways that indicate that they're inferior, and as if treating them isn't the way, isn't how they're becoming inferior. Like oh, they're inferior, so we treat them to be inferior, when no, you're making them inferior by the way you're treating them. And so it's this post hoc ergo propter hoc logic of we want them to be a race, so we treat them like one and then they become one, right? So it's a thing. So some of the ways in which this happens, there are various ways in which this happens, but the main, I boiled it down to like two things that are happening. And you can, and it's once you realize that these two things are always happening when race is happening, then you can recognize it even in the ancient world. So one thing that is going on is monsterification, or demonization is another way you could talk about it, in religious kind of ideas, right? But the idea is that you're claiming that this other group is so different in from humans that they are monsters, right? So monsterification is one element, and then this is backed up by double standards in the laws, social categories, etc. Okay, so first you've created this idea that um, that the racialized group are not human. They're subhuman. They are monsters. Whether they actually appear to be so or not, essentially deep down inside they are, right? So it's this, and then the ways in which you treat them or project images of them proves it, right? And so um, Du Bois, when his Souls of Black Folks, which my class is going to be looking at, um, talks about this, that the main problem in America in the 20th century, and we can continue on to say the 21st century, is the problem of the color line. And what he means there is that they in America, um, the black and white color line is the way in which all like how all of racial dynamic works. And the color line is on the other side. One side of the color line you are a human, and on the other side of the color line you are not, right? And that's what he's sort of getting at. And so here again, it's a monstrification and social double standards. So here's so I'm going to sort of go through a couple of them here. So you've got um the the idea that, okay, here Du Bois in his other thing, he points out that we can't ignore the extraordinary fact that, you know, there was a world campaign beginning with the slave trade, um, and ending with the refusal to capitalize the word Negro in his day. This is in the 40s or 20s, so it's we wouldn't use this word, but he's using it at that time. Um, Leading through a passionate defense of slavery, by attributing every bestiality to blacks, and finally culminating in the evident modern profit, which lies in degrading blacks. All of this has unconsciously trained millions of honest modern men into the belief that black folk are subhuman. So he's already pointing out that there is this campaign, all legitimized or motivated by maintaining the slave or capital the slave system, um, and that is going on there. So so that's the so he already recognized that this is being generated by the desire for slavery there. Okay, so stereotypes in the various media. And what's interesting, what I want to get at is a lot of the stereotypes, especially in the global slave trade, and in America, a lot of the images that are used, or a lot of the sort of mechanisms of racecraft that are used, are often derived from classics. So that's the problem in America. Um, so, for example, the idea of Aesop's fable about washing the Ethiopian has been misunderstood since the Renaissance to mean washing him white, right? And so then this then repeats itself through various racist representations of Africans, where they're being washed. So we have in paintings, and then it becomes soap ads, and so it becomes globalized in soap ads. Uh, so this is, but notice it's starting first in, but what's happening is it's this monstrification of black skin. There's something particularly monstrous about black skin, and it needs to be washed off, right? All right. So then another mechanism, very obvious mechanism, but people don't notice it's happening a lot because you're being carried away by the stories. But storytelling is a very dominant mechanism, whether fiction, history, however you're going to storytell, news, whatever. Storytelling is a very powerful mechanism for creating this mystification of race and justifying and naturalizing race. So I've got a good one here. This is an Italian film, but it was actually shown in the US as well. And it's related to how Italian Americans become white because they are originally considered black, right? And then in the turn of the century, especially when the Jim Crow laws kick in, and the terrorism against blacks really amplify, Italians want to assimilate to whiteness. And so it's not an accident that around this time we start getting a lot of classical films in Italy that are then brought to America, and that tell the story. So here you've got Cabiria, which is a story that's set in Carthage, about this girl Cabiria who gets carried off. But what's interesting is that we're in Carthage, and all the actors are going to be white, right? And we have one slave though. Again, Romans don't necessarily have to have black slaves. They had slaves from wherever they conquered. So, but nonetheless, in this Cabiria, the slave is a black African, supposedly. However, oh yeah, and the other thing is too is that this film came out right before the notorious Birth of a Nation film in America, which is, like the one of the major films in terms of cinematography, but it's also a major vehicle for white supremacy in America, right? Where they're glorifying the KKK and monstrifying African Americans, etc. But anyway, so it's in around the same time. Now, what's interesting in this film is that the African slave is actually, of course, because Africans aren't allowed to be African Americans were not really in major films, so they had to use an Italian actor who was in blackface, so that which is already a thing of a way of dehumanizing African Americans. In terms of like parodying African Americans, white minstrels and actors would put on black paint and dance around and sort of mock African Americans. So here you have that being brought in, where he's darkening his skin to be the African slave, um, and then he became, but the thing is that he's a great guy in the story, right? Like he's the hero, and he's so kind and he's wonderful. So they decide that it is also around the time of Italian unification. So like Italian identity is coming up. Italian Americans are having an issue, and so everybody wants him to be their hero, the hero of Italian hero, the Italian hero, the symbol. And then but then the northern Italians and those Italians who want to assimilate to whiteness are like, no, he can't be our hero because he's of course black. And so what they do, but they want to have, but then of course you've got the financial impetus of like, well, this film's going to make a lot of money because everybody loves this character, right? So what they decide to do is, okay, we're going to have a sequel. Makiste is the character, and we're going to have more Makiste films, and they have a lot that come after that. But first, we've got to like do some racial surgery has to happen, right? So we change him from African, make him Northern Italian, and we change his skin from black to white, and all of this. And so but then we also are conscious about it. So in the film, the first Makiste film, you have Makiste shows up disguised as an African slave, of course in blackface, and then you have Makiste later washes off for everybody to see that he's washing off his black skin. And also, when they were still showing Cabiria before this one came out, the actor Pagano would go to the theater and be there so you could see him as a white skinned or lighter skinned Italian, and he would have his black face and wipe it off, etc. So you could see that, well, the reason why he's such a good, nice person in Cabiria is because he's really white deep down inside, right? And not like he couldn't possibly be a black person, right? So this is what we call racecraft, right? Where you're keeping the idea. Another one is this persists in America, especially when we come to the sword and sandal films, where it's often it's Cleopatra. There's another one coming out. Like, I don't know if it's out yet, but it's coming out. But it's often Cleopatra. So the focus on Egypt for all the time is always to do Cleopatra. And I think one reason why is of course Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is also implicated in the same idea, which is that, well, it's the part of Egyptian history where you could claim that white people came to Africa and dominated the place, right? Or came to Egypt and dominated the place. So that's why we like Cleopatra, as opposed to say Hatshepsut or Ramses or something like that. Like there's a tendency to do that. It's less complicated about like what is the identity, quote unquote, racial identity of the Egyptians. Doesn't come into it as much, you'd think, but it turns out it's very complicated with Cleopatra. But in these sword and sandal films, to get back to it, is that there's a persistent representation of the slaves as black. Um, whether they were Roman slaves, Egyptian slaves, whatever. And even though this would be actually inaccurate historically, that all the slaves were black, like the slaves would have come from all over the world, especially in the Roman films. The slaves would have come from all over the world. But the idea that these films are trying to get at is that black people are natural slaves. So Aristotle's idea of the natural slave. Well, who's the natural slave? Well, black people are African descended people are Africans are natural slaves. So these films just continually repeat this idea, to make that go through. And notice it's in 63, right up against the civil rights movement. We're still showing this, right? Okay. All right. So now we'll go to the history. So now bear in mind that as how race is constructed. Now think about how in America we're going to focus on America and um, what's going on here in the U.S. and how it's in. So the other thing I want to say is that, yeah, so race is going to be particular. Now, initially, when you have slave like the so slavery always existed. Like, let's start there, right? Slavery always existed, and race, I think, always went along with slavery. However, in antiquity, um it never really occurred to ancient theorizers of justifiers of race and slavery, to worry about what people looked like. Because if you actually said we're only going to go for the straight haired people, then you limit the amount of slaves you can actually have, right? So when we see Aristotle, we actually catch him in the act, coming, creating a justification, a naturalization for slavery, when he's trying to come up with a way of saying that they're natural slaves. But it never occurs to him to think about appearance, like any physical features, because the way people became slaves in antiquity was through conquest. And so if we need our next door neighbors to be our slaves and they look exactly like us, uh well, didn't we just say only people with straight hair are slaves? Our next door neighbors also have curly hair. We now have to come up with a new system. So he what you see him doing in the politics, I think, is he's struggling to come up with some way of describing this natural slave that will justify it as a thing in the world, when but he admits too that, well, some people say that slavery is a fiction of the law, but I say it's natural. Well, it turns out he's lying. It is a fiction of law, and he's trying to justify it. But yeah, so in the ancient world, it was much more ubiquitous that you're going to have people are going to be dehumanized based on them being a slave, right? But what happens in the Renaissance, and later when we start having this global colonialism, and especially with the discovery of the new world, quote unquote new world, um, and the desire to have these great plantations in North America and Brazil and the Caribbean, is and the actually uptick in slaves, like at the in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, actually slavery was going down in terms of there wasn't as much slavery around the world as had been before. But then with the discovery of the New World, slavery increased, because now we want to have massive plantations, and so we're trying to get a lot of slaves. But there's also, wherever there are slaves and slavery, there's also always people who are not happy with it. At the minimum, the slaves, right? So there are voices of resistance to slavery all the time. Now, what starts to happen in that period is the voices of resistance are become aligned with economic interest, and that is interesting, because that means something can actually happen. So in so I'm going to get to the birth of America specifically. So when we're with these the European colonial powers start trading with with Africa, whole African continent to get slaves, like because and bringing them to the New World for their various colonies, etc. Now, and so we'll have Margot Hendricks come and talk about how the racecraft in that period generates anti-blackness. But the point is that, okay, we need natural slaves. People with black skin look a little different than us. Maybe we can use that as a way of identifying some natural slaves, right? Um, Now, so in general, there was a colorism, what we might call colorism, happening in the period where people just darker and can be enslaved, uh, fine, right? But what happens in between the British and the American, like when America becomes a separate entity from the British Empire, um, the trajectory of race in terms of white black racism takes a different direction. So the invention of the white race, in other words, starts happening around this time, partly due to the British and Americans uh, leading up to the war between, like the split off of the America from Britain, but a lot of it has to do with the way in which the British are going to develop their economic system in relation to slavery, and the way the U.S. is going to develop its economic system in relation to slavery, and the British are going to become more quote unquote abolitionist, right? Because they're going to want to get rid of slavery in the colonies because it's in their economic interest to do so, right? And so they have a campaign against slavery, whereas it's the American economic basis is slavery, and so they want to maintain their economy, and so they develop a racecraft that helps to maintain that. So this is one of the reasons why we can't really just overlap British racism, anti-black racism, from with American anti-black racism, or why, say, Canadian anti-black racism is not the same as American anti-black racism, because each country has they're all in a tangled relationship to each other, but each one has a different perspective. So here, what happens in the American Revolution, which is the war where the Americans split off from England, is that as part of their tactic to defeat the Americans, the British decide to get offer the slaves freedom, and this, of course, is going to upset the economy in America, and so that's the first move, right? Um, is that, okay, we're going to all of a sudden free slaves in America, and then what we're going to do with them is another question, right? But okay, we're going to free slaves, and we're offering them slaves. If they fight for us, we'll give them freedom. And then it's not really working well enough. It's working somehow, but not well enough. So then they say, well, will anyone who's a slave, whether you could be a woman, if you come onto our side, we will give you freedom. So a lot of slaves go to the British side, and end up in Canada as a result, right? So there you get the Canadians get involved, and also Sierra Leone becomes another colony that they create. But the point of that, well, of course, is to justify is to upset the economic system for the Americans, or the soon to be Americans, and of course, then the Americans have to have a response in terms of why slavery is okay, right? And so we also get this. So Lord Dunmore in Virginia, he has a regiment of slaves. He calls them Ethiopian regiment. They're part of his um, fight against the Americans, right? So you've got this happening where, there's an alliance here. But what's interesting is that, of course, it doesn't ultimately benefit the Black people because they're being used as pawns in the system. Now, another important event that's going to crystallize this extreme hostility to African Americans, or the intensity in America of that African Americans are supposed to be slaves, are supposed to be a subjugated people, is the Haitian Revolution that happens uh, at the time as well. So all this, the French Revolution makes everybody start to think, all men are equal in libertas, fraternitas, egalite, whatever. So, but all these people have slaves, but that's okay. So of course the French are the ones that are doing. Oh, there's Phil. Okay, the French are the ones that are with their freedom thing, and so of course the French colony slaves in the French colony think the same thing, and the only as far as history goes, as far as we know, the Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave rebellion in the as far as world history is concerned, right? And so this produced the colony or the country of Haiti, which of course is in the American sphere of influence, and so the current, um, devastation and economic oppression that goes on in Saint Domingue is directly related again to the U.S. need to um, not have an example of slaves who could free themselves and set themselves up as a self-governing community, right? So a lot of the policies of U.S. policies toward Haiti and Dominican Republic have a lot to do with the idea of not having an example, a positive example of Black self-rule, right? Because that is going to upset slaves in America, right? So, all right. So just to go through, so then now bear in mind that so the U.S. wants to maintain, and this is not just the South. U.S. though at the time the South was the more powerful economic powerhouse, right? The initial colonies were the southern ones were much more economically powerful, but nonetheless, it's not just the South, but a lot of the abolitionists tend to show up in the North, right? But in general, it's not just the South. So you got the American economy is slave driven, and they want to maintain it for the most part, especially the powerful members in the South. And most of American presidents um, were from the South in this period. So bear that in mind, right? So they want to maintain this. And then you have on the other side, the English are developing their own economic setup that's based on free labor, right? And they are pushing against slavery. They're trying to wipe out slavery because it benefits their economic system. So the English start laws, no importation of slaves. You would say, okay, fine, we're no importation of slaves, right? But this is like right after the Haitian Revolution, remember, right? Then you have they try to end the transatlantic or circumatlantic slave trade. So no transporting people from Africa to America. So what are we going to do? Well, what Americans do, they do some secret, under the table black market stuff, of course, but also they produce slaves by rape in America. So that's another whole animal that we have to worry about. What are we going to do with people? So the abolitionists, what are we going to do with some slaves that get freed? We want to free our slaves. Well, we don't want them to live in America, right? Because that's another thing. So we create, as like Sierra Leone was a colony they created, and if the British created here, the Americans create Liberia as a colony for, okay, well, if you're going to free your slaves, or send them to Liberia, right? But they can't live here. You can't have. We really don't want to have free Black people running around because that's going to upset the apple cart. Okay. And so then, of course, the British make their big move, which is, in their economic interest, which is in 1833, they abolished slavery in all the British colonies. That means the Caribbean, which is, down in the backyard of the US, right? And that's really problematic because you have Cuba, which is Spanish, and it's a slave colony, or slave colony. And then you have South America, Brazil, which is also a slave colony. But then you have the Caribbean islands that are all British. They all are now free black rulings, or free societies with free black people. What do you do with there? So needless to say, the US starts uh, developing policies to sort of support slave owning, or slave society, sort of in the way we might consider it in terms of like how Western, European and American economies, which are capitalistic, tend to be hostile to non-capitalistic um, economic societies, right? So that's precisely the same thing. So in the U.S. at the time, the slave economy folks are going to be pro other slave economies, because if you operate in a world where everybody recognizes that slaves are commodities that can be bought and sold, then people aren't just going to steal your stuff, basically, right? So that kind of thing. And so, and here, Matt Karp, in his recent book on the vast Southern Empire, so Britain's decision to free the Caribbean slaves changed the basic order of things in the Western Hemisphere. The world's most powerful nation had now begun to organize its considerable economic, diplomatic, and military resources in opposition to one of American society's most fundamental institutions. Right. So the point then, yeah, is that, remember, Britain is more powerful at this point, and so they've decided, we're going to have a different economic system, and the response is the Americans have to readjust. All right. And so then, of course, in between this, now after this, you have the folks in the North, where there's been a lot of, you could say, British infiltration, like it's a lot of thinking, a lot of the thinking and economic people in the North are much more economically tied to England, even though they may have been fought against the war, but they're still economically tied to England. And so, and also you have like the philosophical ideas that were also more prominent in the North, where there were fewer slaves. Not to say that there weren't any slaves; there were slaves in the North. However, there were fewer slaves. The economy was less dependent on slavery in the North, and so you end up with, ultimately, the Civil War is about whether we're going to extend slavery to other states, new states that are coming into the Union, and this kind of thing. But once we have the Civil War, and the North wins, and they free the slaves as part of, like, sort of like a grudging concession of Lincoln, he frees the slaves. Then there's, for the brief moment, there is this brief moment of actually trying to have a multiracial democracy, where we're going to give equal rights to African Americans. Like, of course, at the time, only men had the right to vote and participate in politics. And so African American men, as white men, were elected to the various Congress, etc. That didn't last very long, because that was just not going to happen. So even though slavery is now illegal, that doesn't mean that we can't come up with something very similar to slavery. And during but in order to sort of, here's where the comparison kind of with Germany at the end of World War II and the Civil War is similar, because what you have is the Northern Army is actually stationed in the southern states to make sure that everybody sort of behaves themselves according to, like, how they're in their reconstructing of their economy, making sure that everything is kind of fair. The Northern Army is there. Now, there's the election of 1876, which is all of a sudden in the news because that's the sort of precedent that Ted Cruz and uh, what's the other one, Holly or whatever, the president they're basing their objections to Biden's election is actually this election, 1876, where they were disputing the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, and in order to sort of get over the quarreling about it, they came up with a compromise, and the compromise, one of the sort of things that were sort of part of the compromise was that the North would withdraw their military from the South, so they wouldn't be there backing up any kind of backing up the slaves, the freedmen, right, in their claims for justice. And so what then happened is, of course, all the rollback of all the freedom equality stuff was immediately sort of started to disintegrate. And of course, you start to have the terrorism that, oh, sorry, I can go back a bit. The terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan and all that started to happen. Like, okay. And so it's not, so it's kind of interesting too that it's in this period too, this after post Reconstruction era, that you start to get all these theories about race as a scientific thing. It's in exactly the same period, right? Um, where you're starting to get, oh, measuring people's head size and nostril length, and but it's also, of course, a mode of monstrification, right? By claiming that um, here, using the Belvedere Apollo statue as the perfect human face, and then comparing, claiming that African skulls are more like chimpanzee skulls or whatever. This is monstrification um, dressed up as science, right? And so, but this is the period though that's happening because, of course, we're ratcheting up the justifications for why Black people should be subjugated to white people, right? Even if they're not slaves, they should effectively be slaves, right? And so by 1896, we end up with what we call the era that's called Jim Crow, after this, again, sort of parodic, um, monstrifying figure of Jim Crow, where basically the idea of separate but equal is established, where you have, Black people can't use the same bathrooms, can't use water fountains, all of that. And so there are these laws that bring this about, right? Uh, there are various laws that are put together in succession. And so, like the first one, what they call the slaughterhouse cases, or it's called the slaughterhouse cases, um, is basically so Henry Louis Gates, in his book on the Stony the Road, points out that, well, this law, the first one, doesn't really go after the Reconstruction policies that basically make African Americans equal, um, but if the vote is sort of split 5-4, and so it narrows the application of this everybody's being equal amendment, the 14th Amendment, right, which is the voting rights amendment, and then so holding that it only protects the rights derived from um, national citizenship, so federal citizenship, not state citizenship. So when we keep hearing all this states' rights stuff, it's actually this is what they're getting back to. Um, so how you're treated nationally is one thing. Yeah, sure, you're free, whatever. But in Georgia, no, that's a different animal. There's the local laws apply. So that was the first move, and then the next move, there's a series of civil rights cases that happen after that, where that came from there's a Colfax massacre in Louisiana, where Black people were massacred, and the court ruled that due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment again applied only to state civil rights violations, not civil rights violations by individuals now. So now, if only if the government is the one that did the massacre, then you can have a claim. But if it's just regular, yahoos, no, you don't. And then the real blow, of course, is Plessy versus Ferguson, where Homer Plessy, Rick's race, notice the name Homer, Black people tended to be given Roman or Greek names, classical names, to, I don't know, mocking names. But anyway, so Homer Plessy, a mixed race man, was removed from a whites only train. Um, and he told the conductor that he was 1/8 black, right? So he's only 1/8 black. He probably looked very fair skinned, but he was black enough for the conductor. And anyway, what happened was he ended up in jail for violating the law. And so then he sued, but of course that didn't work. And so he lost that case. And this then established what we call the separate but equal law. And what's interesting is the minority dissent, the dissent by Justice Harlan, um, who actually is a Kentucky justice. Um, and he's slave owning and he's pro-slavery generally, right? But he says, but in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, right, there is hold on a second here again. Oops, can't see here. Yeah, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind. Neither knows or tolerates classes among citizens. Respect of civil rights. All citizens are equal before the law. So interesting. So he's actually claiming, oh, we don't have race here. Like we don't have, which is the whole case was an example of that. But interesting. So but he at least knows that's what the law, the Constitution has that built in, that actually this shouldn't be the case. And similarly, so John Calhoun, who is very strong pro-slavery in the antebellum era, the pre-Civil War era, he complained about the Constitution, claimed that Jefferson, in his statement about all men being equal, created equal, he should have said all white men. Like he actually thought that Jefferson had made a mistake there because it opened up the possibility to have black people, black men at least, as equals. And so he was really kind of not happy about that. So here that same conclusion is being made by Harlan, right? That the Constitution actually would seem, if you read it properly, would imply that everybody is equal. But apparently that case was lost. So that means that the opposite of what he's saying is true. In other words, we now have race. And so what you get then, and so Du Bois also points this out, yeah, what defines a black person is the person who has to ride Jim Crow in Georgia. That's it's all the social institutions around that person that are making them black, not anything to do with them per se, but it's the desire of the superstructure to subjugate. All right, so we can think, so that in this period now, the post-Reconstruction up to the civil rights, of course, and there's a reassertion of, or recalibration of reifying as much as possible the difference between, or a difference between black and white. And of course, you also have this proliferation of Confederate monuments. Notice that it's around the time that we're talking about where we're getting this spike in Confederate monuments, even in places like Kentucky, where they fought on the north side. Confederate monuments are popping up. So and but again, these Confederate monuments are part of the racecraft, right? Part of the way in which you construct race. And so then Frederick Douglass, who is one of the freed slave major abolitionist one of the people elected to government in the Reconstruction period. He says, when men oppress their fellow men, the oppressors ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification of his oppression. Again, this idea that, well, it's about oppression. You're going to find whatever you need to justify that oppression in that person. If you want to oppress them, you know, look, whatever you're looking for, you're going to find. Basically, if you're looking for it, you'll find it. And then that brings us to the yesterday or this week, right? Where amazingly, you know, with all the stuff that's going on too, like with the this is the most outrageous picture given the you know, from the perspective of the Civil War, to have the Confederate flag now actually inside the Capitol is an assertion again of white supremacy, you know, against the government, right? Again, the U.S. government, right? Because the U.S. government again is lately has become more multiracial, and also women are in the government. But it's again, it's not an accident. I think that Ted Cruz and the folks who are defending the claim that Trump didn't lose the election are appealing to this 1876 law or compromise, because the real underlying sort of message of that movement is the reassertion post Obama's election of white supremacy. And so, and the people have been posting these comparing the differences as well between the treatment, again, unequal treatment. You just consider how Black Lives Matter protests have been characterized as riots and whatever, and how there's a lot of course, on the right, to pretend that, oh, it's just protests, and when it's riots. So, like, what are you going to call these things? But what's interesting was the state response, institutional response to both. Like when it's the Black Lives Matter, the whole military industrial complex is out there waiting to meet everybody. Whereas one of the main shocking things about the Capitol riots was how involved and complicit a lot of the police and military, you know, were, and how just like they just waltzed right into the Capitol with their Trump slash Confederate flags, right? So, but so the last thing I wanted to say is that about race in relation to the U.S. and I think it matters in any culture, but we're focusing on the U.S. here, is that the mechanisms to reinforce race are always moving, always changing, and so. But it's really, once, as I said, once a group has been racialized, it really takes a lot to unracialize them, and more likely than not, violence is going to be involved, right? That's been the case in history of the U.S. that we're going to maintain Black people as a race by violence, right? Whether it's KKK and people, whether it's guys being killed by the police with no repercussions. Basically, the point is that the humanity of Black people has been alienated, right? Because you're not giving the same dignity and humanity to the Black life as you are to the white life, right? So, and or in this case, yeah, you're not just. Here's a case of like disparate treatment for the two groups. All right, so that's all I have to say about that to get you guys history wise. Phil can jump in and make some comments since he's the other in the know American-ish person. I'm American-ish. Phil is American.
American-ish,
Well,
right?
I'm Canadian, living in America, so I'm.
For me, the most interesting aspect of this was the historical period around the revolution when you talked about the uh, abolition of slavery in 1833 in England.
Mhm.
Because have you ever read Colin Calloway's New Worlds for All? Do you remember that book? Have you ever encountered it, Dr.
No,
Murray?
no.
Oh, it's a really, you would probably enjoy it. But he actually is a specialist in Native American studies. He used to be at University of Wyoming, but now he's at Dartmouth, I think. But he talks about during the leading up to the American Revolution, the desire of the British to drive home the point that the Americans, as in general, all Americans, were not Europeans, and
Hmm.
that they were more like the what they termed, savage races of America, of the Americas, and their arose all this writing and terminology, casting Americans, describing the way they looked, said they looked like natives, they didn't
Right.
look like
Okay.
Europeans, they didn't behave. And Calloway kind of makes the point that he wants to sort of say some of that is true, that what makes Americans different from Europeans is that they took some aspects of native thinking and native culture, especially on the frontier, and brought them together. Now, why I was thinking of that is we hear, I'm new to all this, so I hear these phrases like people in graduate studies in the United States use the phrase othering a lot. Is othering, do you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about
yeah, I know
here?
what you're talking.
I hear it a lot these days at UK. But is that the same thing as racecraft? Is that what are
Well,
those two
okay, let me stop sharing here. Hold on a second. Yeah. Um,
or
well, um, othering, no, not well, they're related in the sense that othering is basically the ways in which you make other people other.
okay, just
Yeah,
putting
no,
them in
but
another group.
racecraft is actually more of the different mechanisms, right? So and the way in which you're naturalizing the difference. Okay, so you could be treating people differently, but you don't necessarily think of it as a natural thing, right? That they're just you know what I mean. What racecraft does is make the the difference that you've created um, seem like it's a natural thing out in the outside in the world, just like apples and oranges, right? So you're trying to claim that the difference between human beings is similar to the difference between cats and dogs, right? And that would be, and that it's natural, right? So, and how you do it is by scientific discourse or laws, all these different mechanisms, right? But it's kind of similar to othering, but I think othering comes first, and then you get the racecraft that sort of helps everybody digest it.
Okay.
You get what I'm saying?
So so on for the origin of this on like a macro scale, is it taken to be like a program of a particular political class, or is it something in subconscious of people,
But
or is it a political class driving? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I would say would be the dominant group's way of justifying it. And often it is an issue of class, economic
Okay.
um, there. But what you're talking about sounds like that's what the process the British were doing. They're
Right.
I,
Yeah.
oh, so okay.
There
What about
arose
othering?
all this.
Othering is okay. I just realized another way of thinking about othering is when you're part of the dominant group and you're
Okay.
making a subset of that dominant group, pushing them into the ethnicity category, right? Like I was like, or even the racial category. So that's othering, right? So remember, I
Okay.
had my continuum. Maybe I'll put it back up. Um, yeah, I think if I put the continuum back up, we might be able to talk about othering. Okay, go back. here we go. Okay. So I think othering is where you're moving people away from what counts as the same, like what counts as the dominant group, right?
Okay.
So so let's say the British do this with Irish, right? So and then
Right.
right, um, earlier scenario, they're seen as the same. So Americans are seen as British because they're part of the British Empire, but now they're annoying and hostile, and we want to go to war with them. So the process of making them now different from us is othering. Whereas racecraft is once you've othered them, especially if then it's all the mechanisms by which they seem similar because it could be storytelling and science and all of that, only that the goal is different, I would say. So othering is to make them different, whereas racecraft is to maintain the difference that you've created. So they're related, they're very related. They're I mean, there's like a Venn diagram where they would be like highly overlapped there.
Okay.
But could you put the name of that book in the chat so that people could get that? Because definitely would like to look at that as well, because that's another
Absolutely.
aspect of the British are creating trying to put the Americans in a sort of new racialized category, right? Because because you already had Native Americans racialized as well. The one group I forgot to mention though was the indigenous people, mainly because the policy toward the indigenous people was just wipe them out. Right? That's
Well, that's
or assimilate them. Either you assimilate or you are exterminate. That was the basic policy of it has been the policy in America in terms of race. It's like with indigenous people, it's either exterminate or assimilate. Those are your options, right? But you're going to
mhm.
say something, Phil.
Well, on the exterminate or eliminate, that comes out especially. I was recently reading Empire of the Summer Moon, which is a really fun read, by the way, but it's about the Comanche Nation in Western Texas. And I think driving a lot of that is that culture, especially among the Comanche, they did not and want to become a part of white European culture and made it very clear from the beginning. If you look in the 1850s and 1860s, a little before the later, what is considered the Indian Wars period, 1870s and 1880s, their chiefs are really laying out these, what I think are really actually quite beautiful statements of the US government saying, we'll give you farm implements, we're going to give you houses, we're going to give you 2.5 million acres in Oklahoma if you will just go over there and behave like us, right? And they say, the statements of these chiefs are so beautiful. They say, but we don't want to be anything like you. We don't want to adopt, we don't want to farm. And in fact, the way they frame it is in terms of freedom.
Mm.
And Colin Calloway points some of this out too in his book, but they say that we would be slaves then if we go and we live on this little 2.5 acres and are spending all our time digging up beets. We are slaves. Whereas, and one of the chiefs makes this great statement. He says, I know every creek and every river and every tree between what is essentially Kansas and Texas. He says, that's where I've lived my whole childhood and everything I know. And I thought it was interesting when you were talking about the Reconstruction period, that is simultaneous. That is almost
Yeah.
simultaneous with the total subjugation of the Comanche Nation
Yeah.
by the U.S. government. And in fact, the year's almost dead on, 18th or mid 18th, just after the Civil War to the late 1870s.
Right.
And it's interesting to me, and I don't know if I have worked this out in my mind, but I watched, you said in the Reconstruction era, the idea is to create this sort of multiracial nation where a lot of offices in the South are given to Black Americans and things like that by the U.S. government. And but there's no attempt to do that with the Native groups. Nobody goes to one and says, "Hey, would you like to be a congressman?" uh, to one, and some of these chiefs are very powerful.
Right.
Nobody tries to engage them at all in the culture, and that is just sort of interesting to me why that plays out that way. why
Yeah.
that plays out that way, why the U.S. government doesn't have similar policies for all racial groups. I don't know if there's somebody you know of
Yeah.
who's.
Well, I think
Mhm.
mainly because they don't believe in equality of
Right,
all groups,
right,
right? And that there are different things they're getting out of the different groups, right? So in the case of the Native Americans, um, they're getting land or whatever, right? And so
right.
this is the extreme settler colonialism where well, this land is ours. Oh, there's people here already. Oh, well, we need to get rid of them, right? Or bring them in,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, Anya.
Yeah, I think what you said about the institutions that support this whole system of slavery and racecraft is very important. So, in addition to the comparison with the First Nations, this case from the Brazilian slave who came to Prussia in the 19th century can be very enlightening, I think. There's this case of a Brazilian slave who was bought by somebody who had a German ancestry and still a brother in Dresden, and that was in 1854.
Around
And so, sorry?
around the same time.
Right. And so this Brazilian, like he was a merchant of some sort, and he had settled in Brazil, and he had bought this slave called Marcelino. And then he made a trip back home to see his brother in Dresden and took this Marcelino with him as a slave. Marcelino, he had a passport stating that he was a slave. And so he came to Prussia, where there was no institutionalized slavery. And so Marcellino sued, like they went to Dresden first and then to Berlin. And Marcellino, he got in contact with influential people, so he got the chance to sue his owner, right, to let him free. And he argued that the owner had stolen his person from him, right, by enslaving. So for theft, basically. And but then the court rejected the claim and said, oh, he must go back because the owner bought him. But then there was no institution who felt responsible for bringing Marcellino back to this person, because there wasn't this whole structure around it. So Marcellino, in fact, remained free, even though the court had rejected the claim. And then 2 years, because this whole case was so it created an uproar, a discussion about it, that 2 years later, Prussia passed a law that banned slavery, that said that if an American slave came to Prussia, he was free immediately. And the discussion about it was not so much that, because really there weren't that many American slaves who ever made it to Europe, right? It's kind of far away, and in the discussion also said, well, it's a theoretical question because how many times does it actually happen that an American slave comes here? The real concern, like why didn't they pass this law earlier, was Russia, because Russia next door, and Russian nobles had not the kind of slavery that Americans had, but they had bondsmen that were kind of in an enslaved status. And Russian nobles would travel to Western Europe quite frequently and stay in Prussia. So they were kind of concerned that by passing a law that would free everyone that was enslaved would anger the Russian Empire, right? So you get this whole mixture of philanthropic considerations, philosophical consideration, but a very strong political and economical fact to this.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So Phil, did you put the titles?
Yes, on my side it's showing it's in there.
In mine. No, it doesn't show up in mine.
It went as a direct message.
Because I was happy. I have it here.
You got it? You got it?
Oh, I've got it. You send it directly to me.
Oh, directly to Anya.
Yeah,
okay, yeah.
Yeah, I can pass it on
with everybody.
Just a moment.
That'll be that. I would like to have that. And
there it is.
Great. Yeah. Colin Calloway.
He's written several books. Yeah, he also wrote one on the Shawnee Wars in Northwest Territory on the Ohio River. Also, I'm sure he has far more than that.
Mm.
Like other questions and consideration from the colonial side? Did you understand in this, Frau Merke?
The German students don't have anything
Oh,
to say.
yeah. Do you hear me? You
Yes,
do?
yes, we do. Yeah, Carla.
With all these thoughts about Native Americans, and I've got a feeling that it's quite a question of interest, but I didn't really get what the interest of the English was to stop slavery. Has it something to do with the Industrial Revolution, or why
Yes,
did they stop it? Why didn't
yes,
they
yeah,
need it anymore, or even have an interest to stop it?
yeah. It has to do with yeah, they're developing economy, industrial economy that is going to be based on wage labor, and they want to be the manufacturing of so cotton is generated in this, like the raw materials is generated in the South, but the processing of it is generated in England or um, in the Northern America, right? And so the British, it's in their economic interest um, not to have free labor when they have to pay for labor and they don't want to enslave white people, right? They like British, um, so they want to have some kind of skilled labor, but they also, the population they have in England or is predominantly white Anglo, right? And so people are of course going to not be okay with being enslaved, so they want to have an economy based on low wage labor, let's just say, right? And similar to like Anya was mentioning about the Prussian nobles, they do have servants which are effectively slaves. When you think about going into service in England means you're basically a house slave, but with some amounts of freedom, right? So yeah, so there wasn't this the willingness to enslave lower classes. It was not there, but they needed the labor, and so they're willing to pay low wages for the labor, um, but they can't compete with people that have free labor, right? So
This
we
was,
get rid of that.
pardon. I was going to say this was a big debate around before the Civil War, during the Civil War. If you read Lincoln's own speeches, he's a big proponent of what they called, correct me if I have this wrong, Dr. Murray, but the free wage, he calls it the free wage labor system,
Mhm.
because a lot of his political supporters were Northern industrialists, a lot
Right.
of his political support. And the economic system, as Dr. Murray says, of free labor was not only a threat at first to England, but also eventually to the northern system, because there was all in the popular press, there was a lot of comparisons. This is sort of the first birth of labor movements,
Yeah.
because people are being treated very terribly in England. In fact, 19th century England, it's rather notorious, the amount of child labor and all these other things going on the island. And some of that was starting to transfer to places like Massachusetts, and there started to be comparisons
Yeah.
where people were saying things, well, I'm no better than a slave. And after the Civil War,
Right.
this issue came back because a lot of Black Americans that were freed went to places like Chicago and things like that, and under this promise of, well, now you'll be an equal American, now you are a free American, and then ended up, were immediately given a job where they're like, well, now you get to work 16 hours a day over here in this factory. Or your children get to work in this factory, or you get, and so there was a lot of discussion about, in fact, I think in a lot of ways in America, the labor movement is heavily tied to the slavery issue.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah, and in fact,
Because
yeah, well, in fact, also because of that and the possibility of solidarity between
Right.
freed slaves and low wage white workers, we now virulent racism was injected into the system, right? To keep
Yes.
those
Yeah.
groups apart, because then they would go against the rich, whether it's the industrialists in the north or the southern plantation owners in the south. Yeah, so yeah, they didn't want they want to I think they just don't want to see in terms of the British had the same economic. That's what I was saying, that the British were in line with the North, because they have the same kind of economic system. Though the North was trying to sort of cut England out of the manufacturing,
Right.
right?
Right.
By building their own mills in the North. So that's what's going on post after the Civil War. The North starts to try to build mills, either in the North or even in the South, to sort of cut off the British control of the market. And so yeah, so it's not in the British, like they're like two opposing economic systems. So that you might think of, yeah, the way in the Cold War had with communism versus capitalism, two perceived to be incompatible economic systems, and each side is trying to defend their side. And what's interesting is it now scholarship on is recognizing that the we recognize that, like, it's always been known that the British were trying to crush the slavery, because it's always there. But now a lot of scholarship on the American side is noticing that, wait a second, the Americans were also fighting back as well, and it's actually the fact that they did fight back why the U.S. is the dominant player in the world now, right? It's because of that, uh, the way they were fighting back against the crushing of their economic system, even though they still managed to have to get rid of slavery. But yeah, so that was a good question. Yeah, why were the
Yeah.
British so annoyed?
More questions?
Yeah,
Maria?
my question goes back to antiquity again. Can it be assumed that Aristotle was the one who put the first thought of racism in words?
I
No.
don't think so. No, I think that he might be the first to sort of that we have, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure he is, because I haven't really looked into. Plato has a lot to say about slavery, and haven't really looked. I plan on looking into that. Um, but in Plato's so much stuff to read, right? but in terms of the most famous theorizing of slavery, is the politics, the master slave thing. There, he's the first to theorize it, but it's clear that it's not a new idea. I don't think it's a new idea when he's theorizing it. And he says, he says that people are, he says that, there's some people say that slavery is a fiction of the law, and he then going to argue that it's not. So clearly there's been debate. Like there is some controversy about slavery going on that he's responding to, or theorizing, right? So yes, I don't think he's at all the first to do that. And I'm yeah, I think he's the first to sort of try to explicitly claim that there are people who should be slaves, but I don't think that people didn't think that already. Like, basically, they're definitely the idea of,
Interesting.
right? Like, those who conquer, if you're conquered, you are enslaved. Everybody sort of take that as for granted, right? That conquest equals enslavement, and that's already in the Iliad and in the Odyssey, right?
Yeah.
That you are going to be enslaved, and you're going to lose your humanity once you're conquered. So the Iliad is very, very clear about that, right? That's what the women are worried about. Women, especially in general, women are more subject to, I think in the case of Aristotle, I think what the issue is for him is not so much, is really, how do we come up with a way of defining a group of people that are natural slaves in the same way that we, women are inferior, right? Like it's easy to say women are inferior because they have different bodies than we do, and it's based on a natural. So women are inferior; they have different bodies, right? So we've already got that. So why it'd be really cool if we could come up with a way of making other men inferior based on something as natural as having different bodies.
Yeah.
So then that's but he can't. So he says, well, maybe they're less smart. Maybe he. But yeah, so I think that's what's like it's they're women are automatically enslavable. That's a given, right? Because if their husbands or brothers and fathers get killed in the war, women and children are enslaved. There you go, right? And that was the fact of life. But it's men. How do we enslave other men, especially other men that we fought in a war? They were warriors like we were. How do we do that? Like, how does that work? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and then that's interesting, the theory that Aristotle has, that the fact that you're being enslaved and conquered makes you lose a third of your soul.
yes,
That's
exactly.
right. Once you are militarily or by force
Yeah.
overwhelmed,
Mhm.
that very fact makes you lose a third of your soul. So
Right.
you're not, you don't have a complete soul anymore, which
Right.
is interesting.
Yeah.
You
Oh
kind
yeah.
of, it's very easy, and I can say the moment, I have somebody under my control, he is also a slave because his soul is incomplete now. But it
Right.
also says that, the fact of being in somebody else's power does something to you,
Yes.
right?
And it does. We can think in terms of psychology today and trauma studies and things like that, right? That indeed being a victim of trauma somehow forces people to internalize a sense of inferiority, which is not is not true, but it comes because of the pain and suffering of losing your autonomy, right? So yeah, I think Aristotle recognizes that as a weapon of war, right? That you
Yeah,
can.
you have a traumatized group, basically,
Right.
right? You have a group with a history that's full of trauma.
Mhm. Yeah.
So interesting to look at the ways that slaves found to deal with that. I think the music,
Yeah.
for example, right? Black music, it
Yeah.
seems to be one way of self assertion, right?
Right.
Being
Yeah. Yeah.
finding some
And also
sort of autonomy, dealing with trauma, right?
right. Yeah. So yeah, yeah, Aristotle is the most blatant, I think, and very useful for understanding how um you know how because he's also, of course, the seeds of modern racist thinking too. So it's not like he's in isolation to how these modern ideas of race come up, because there's all kinds of appeals to Aristotle from the get-go. But yeah, but the idea that um, the traumatizing or humiliating, this is where, say, hubris is a issue, of course, for Greeks. What is involved in hubris? Hubris is the humiliation of of someone, right? Like, and usually you to make them humiliated, right? And so the violence that you do to them is, you maybe break their leg, or you do something where they're now going to be subjected to different kinds of humiliations, right? So yeah, you why are you doing that? Well, it's part of injecting a sense of inferiority in that person. So you find citizens fight back against that in Athens. Like there's they reject that. Whereas you could do the same action to a medic or a woman who's not a citizen, who didn't have like a protecting male, right? You could do the same kind of violent action. It would not be considered hubris, right? Because they're already inferior. Um, so yeah, so I think the and you see this with the Spartans and the way they treat the helots, where there's these ritualized humiliation of helots, right, to basically keep them in their place. So yeah, that's a good point to bring that up. That yeah, that the losing part of your soul um, is a way of so that would map onto what I'm talking about, being alienating their humanity, right? Is that how that works, where they're made to be thought of, and it's again, it's in this essential behind the scenes kind of thing that's happened to them, which is they've lost part of their soul. Um, so yeah, so the trauma that it's really, really sort of ghoulish, right? Like the trauma that you inflict upon the person, um, you are claiming has made them worth being treated inferior because you've treated them inferior. They are not inferior, but you've treated them so, and that of course makes it possible. Yeah. So yes, and then in a system, yeah, where that's the case, right? Where the problem is that you have to have um you have to stay out of that position, how to stay out of being conquered. Then yeah, you can see how like people would guard that the top position very covetously, like can't let anybody get into this position, where they have free reign to abuse others, right? um, you wouldn't want a lot of people to have that happen to them. Yeah, that was good.
Right. Yeah, I think that was a nice start for the joint sessions that we have. So will you
Thanks
be
Phil, for coming even though class hasn't started.
yeah,
Sure.
you'll be there next week too, Phil,
That's
for
fun.
the Senghor
Are
session.
you gonna come for the next one, Phil?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this will next week I'll tell you
Anya's going to
something.
present.
Yeah, the situation in Senegal with Leopold Sédar Senghor, who was a classicist by training, but also the president of Senegal and also a poet. And so he developed this idea of negritude, right?
Yes.
Of a special way of dealing with the colonial past of sub-Saharan Africa. And that might be interesting as a contrast, because there you get a way of dealing with the problems that he encountered with being a classicist in a very like white dominated field, and at the same time a convinced and proud African, right, for his country, the Senegal. So yeah, I'm trying we'll try to tell you something about that next week.
All right, that would be great. I'm looking forward to that.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Okay.
All
So
right.
then good night to the Europeans.
Nice
Like
to meet you
good
all, Europeans. Good
morning
night.
to the Americans.
Oh, that's German. Is that Dutch? Schlafgut? Is that Dutch or German?
Yeah. Danke.
Oh.
And you have a good day. Ciao.
So that was good, I think.
Yeah, I think it went well.
I think that
I'm gonna stop